All right. Good morning, everyone. I see the go live, or it says I'm live, so that's always a good thing when I see that. Not sure what kind of a crowd we'll get this morning for our live broadcast, but those of you who make it on, please ask questions. I'm doing it old school today, so back here with my old setup all by my lonesome at the research center here at Monmouth. Heather is getting a little much deserved vacation, and so she created this episode for us, which I have yet to learn how to do that all by myself. I continue to need help to put this program on. So Jennifer used to help me a lot, and then she moved on to other things, and now Heather helps me a lot. So some people know this. I need lots of help in lots of areas of life, and putting on Ask the Agronomist is one of them. So I appreciate my production assistants, even when they're not with me. So I will keep an eye on the chat and do my best to see your questions if they come in. And thank you in advance for those who ask questions. You know you're my favorites, right? That we're not supposed to have favorites, but my favorites are the people that take the time to watch live and ask questions. And I appreciate everybody who watches the program or listens to it after it's been recorded. And if you have questions, you can always call me or get a hold of somebody, and we'll answer your questions too. But I love interacting with the live audience. So I'm sitting in the midst of a mess here. You can't see, but I've got corn leaves laying all over the table. I've got silks laying all over the place. I've made a mess here that I'm gonna have to clean up. I got ears of corn that we're gonna look at here today. I've got my phone here with loaded up with pictures of wild, crazy things going on out in the field. So most of you probably know what that is when you see that barber pole pattern of black dots twirled around the leaf sheath on corn. That's just the leaf sheath. That's not on the stalk. That's just on the leaves. But we'll talk about that. That's physoderma. I brought some physoderma plants in with me. We'll talk about how crazy difficult it is to find tar spots still, which blows my mind, honestly. I took this picture. My sales reps will probably cringe when I show this, but I like to do that to them sometimes, as you know. So this picture, I just took this last night in my plots here at Monmouth. So that is a hybrid that last year was one of the poster children for rust and dying off late in the season. This thing is one of our most beautiful hybrids coming out of the ground. I like this hybrid. Mine at home looks just as good as this. It had a rough year last year with disease, late season plant health kind of fell apart. So this is 11041 for anyone who was guessing. And that plot was planted May 13th. That's in our hybrid demo plot at the farm where I plant every single thing that you might be planting. And because my crown rot trial is in the same block of corn on down the way, planted March 31st, we'll talk about that here in a bit. This plot gets no fungicide. So that has never been sprayed with any fungicide. And that is insane that a hybrid that's not particularly healthy, very susceptible to southern rust, relatively susceptible to crown rot, relatively susceptible to tar spot, not particularly resistant to gray leaf spot, looks like that in the absence of fungicide. So if you chose to not spray this year, or maybe spray something that I would say is kind of cheap and crappy, and your corn looks really good, it's not because of what you did, unfortunately. So this is a kind of a crazy year with all this moisture that we've had, but it hasn't been at the right time, in the right environment, with the right temperature, with the right, other things going on to result in the amount of foliar disease that many of us would have expected. Now we are starting to get some reports of southern rust. It is easier to find tar spot than it was a month ago. There will continue to be more disease development as we go through the rest of the growing season. So I'm not saying that the investment that you made in your fungicide program was for naught. I think there's always benefits to applying fungicides, but the benefits of applying fungicides are the greatest when we have heavy disease pressure. And this year we've gotten lucky. I don't have any other way to say it, because I think most people who consider themselves knowledgeable about fungal diseases would have expected us to have pretty significant disease pressure this year. Not everybody was screaming that this was going to be the worst disease year on record. I will admit I sort of was. I jumped the gun pretty significantly on that claim, and was wrong in making that claim. But I think everybody thought that we were going to have a good amount of disease this year, and this is quite possibly going to go down in history as one of the most disease-free years we've had from a fungal foliar disease standpoint. Now we've got disease, we've got crown rot. So speaking of crown rot, just down the way from that beauty there is that. So this is an early hybrid. Now, in full disclosure, that's about getting a text from Zach there. Thanks, Zach. This is a I think that's 102-day corn, planted March 31st. But you will see that the healthy plants are still green as a gourd, and then you've got those dead ones. So that's a ghosted plant. That's crown rot working on that hybrid. And I took another picture here. So this is a good illustration. So there's a 1-row plots. So you can see the row on that side is dead, and the row on that side is green. That's the difference we see in crown rot susceptibility based on hybrid. So hybrid selection is very important if you're worried about crown rot, you're trying to manage crown rot, as is planting date, because this dead hybrid here planted 6 weeks later would not be dead. So planting date is important. That's why I put that plot in the 31st of March. And most of the corn there planted the 31st of March is still green and healthy. So I'm not necessarily saying it's going to be a horrible bad crown rot year either, primarily because we haven't had a lot of stress through grain fill. We had cold, wet conditions early. We had stress early. We had corn that got planted early enough to get severe crown rot. I think we've got a lot of crown rot infections because the fields that did go through pretty severe stress have developed some pretty good crown rot symptomology. And I see I got a question here, and they were told me he's seeing early season tip back. Seems to me it's okay. So surprising. So I don't know what exactly you mean by early season tip back. So I've got an example here of the years I've got setting here. That is the most tip back on any ear. And pollination, I'm going to say to about right here, that ear was pollinated. So above here, I don't think that ever pollinated, but from here down, right through here, it's kind of hard to see, but there are aborted kernels there. And then obviously the last ones to abort, the little bit older ones, the bigger ones here, that's easy to see there's aborted kernels there. And then from here down, everything is good. Now this was the May 13th planting of 118-day hybrid. So if you contrast that to if you can read that, March 31st planting of the same hybrid right next to it, there's a handful of aborted kernels up here at the tip, and you can see pollination got a little wonky here at the end. If you're having perfect pollination, you're going to have corn in straight rows with no gaps, nothing missing. That is a beautifully pollinated ear of corn. Gets a little wonky here at the end. Things kind of start to peter out, and there's a couple aborted kernels here, but very little kernel abortion from this March 31st planting date, and that's all due to timing. So kernel abortion occurs the easiest with the least amount of stress right after the kernel pollinates. And sometimes there's a lot of them on this. So this region right in through here where you really can't even see there was a kernel, that was pollinated, but those kernels probably lived a matter of days, or maybe in some cases a matter of hours before they aborted. So they did not really grow into anything that looked like a kernel. So that abortion was very early on. So the most stressful period of a plant's life, this is one of the reasons I'm a big believer in Strobelier and fungicides being applied at tassel, early tassel, tassel is not really a stage of corn. VT is a stage of corn. That's when the tassel emerges. But once the tassels emerged, it's kind of like using brown silk as a stage of corn. Brown silk's not a stage of corn either. We've talked about that here on Ask the Agronomist before. Once the tassel is there, it's there all summer, right? So it's tassel stage all summer. Well, no, tassel stage is when the tassel emerges, which is the appropriate best time to apply a fungicide. Because in addition to getting ahead of your diseases that we're trying to control, if you believe in the stress relieving properties of the Strobelier and fungicides, which I do, a lot of data backs that up. Some people talk about cooling the canopy with fungicides. I'm not as convinced that that's a real thing, but let's say it is. If you want to cool the corn canopy with a fungicide, you want to do it the first 2 weeks after pollination, because that is the time in that plant's life that it is the most susceptible to heat stress. It is the most susceptible to drought stress. It is the most susceptible to whatever kind of stress, because the easiest time to abort kernels is the first 2 weeks after they pollinate. Once a kernel gets to R3, so this is the youngest ear on the table, it's already starting to dent. So this thing is way past R3, because dent would be R5. R3 would be the roasting ear stage. So that stage when it's just perfect for sweet corn, that's R3. That's the milk stage. Once you get to that stage, you can no longer abort kernels. So this March planted corn, even the kernels at the tip, most of them, got to R3 before we ran into a lot of significant stress. And Merle's question was that it seems like we've had pretty good moisture. What was the stress? Well, the stress was probably some 75, 76 degree nights early after pollination is what caused most of the tip back. So depending on the maturity of the hybrid and depending on when you planted. So for example, this is 118-day corn planted the last day of March. The 102-day corn that I planted the last day of March has no tip back whatsoever. That stuff was so far along before we got stressed, because some people did get stressed in July. Some people got dry. There are a lot of places that only had maybe 1.5 inches of rain in July. And even though you got 3 months worth of rain in June, that does not make up for. Matter of fact, that makes it worse. Getting a whole summer's worth of rain in June, that's where the worst corn is today. You may have noticed that if you're farming in those areas. Places that were drier in June got through a dry July better than the places who were wet in June, because getting excessive amounts of moisture in June did so much damage to our root system. That plant, even though the soil probably had a little more moisture in it in July because of all the rain they got in June, the fact that the soil had more moisture in it's somewhat irrelevant when your roots are sick and not very healthy because of all the suffocation that they suffered through in the month of June. So the worst corn today and the worst corn this fall is going to be wet June followed by dry July. Wet June followed by normal July is probably the second worst corn out there today. The best corn is dry June. And this year, dry June means you only got 8 inches of rain in June. Nobody had a dry June this year. We've had dry Junes in the past. We did not have any dry Junes in the 2026 growing season. So if you were relatively dry in June, you only got 2x normal rainfall. So if you were relatively dry in June, or you happen to farm some very naturally well-drained ground, and then you got reasonably good moisture in July, which there are places that manage to get normal July rainfall. I didn't have normal July rainfall. My best rainfall amount in July on any of my farms was about 3 inches, which is 1.5 inches below normal. 3 inches is plenty to raise a good crop, and I'm thankful that I have a good crop. But very few people got even normal rainfall in July. But the best corn will be the people who got the least rain in June, the most rain in July, typically, regardless of planting date. But the most tip back that you will find tends to be on the later planted corn, because the later planted corn was in a growth stage where it was easier to abort kernels when we had some of those dry periods and some of those hot nights. We really weren't hot enough in the day to hurt anything. It's the hot nights that are really brutal on corn. Those nights when it's still 80 plus when you're watching the 10, does anybody still stay up and watch the 10 o'clock news? That was like a thing when I was growing up. I mean, my parents would stay up to watch the weather, which is usually like you got news, weather, sports, right? Is the way it went. So you'd have to watch the news, whether you wanted to or not, to get to the weather. And then as soon as the weather was over, if you didn't care about sports, you went to bed. And so when you're watching the 10 o'clock weather at night and it's 83 degrees, and the coolest it gets to that night at, say, 4 or 5 in the morning is 75, that is an awful night for corn. A couple of those nights is all it takes to do that to an otherwise healthy corn plant. Now, did this reduce the yield potential of this plant? Yes, it did. Is it going to reduce the actual yield of this plant? Yet to be seen. If these kernels are big enough, you got to look at, this. If you're a glass half empty kind of person, you're focused on the tip that's missing. Look at what's still here. That's a hell of a good ear of corn. If you get good kernel size out of that can out yield this. So if you look at those here today, this one looks better, right? It's bigger. Well, that's because it's older. Now it does have more kernels on it. So this, let's see. No, actually, believe it or not, I counted them. Both of those ears are. This is weird. Everything's backwards when you do this. Both of these ears, believe it or not, are 16 by 35. This 16 by 35 does not look near as impressive as this 16 by 35. But factor this one is 6 weeks younger than this one. Now, does it look like there's 6 weeks difference in those plants? No. And it's because there's not. Because when you plant later, things grow faster. That's the magic of heat unit accumulation. And when you plant earlier, things grow slower. Plus, they get more crown rot. We talk about that a lot. So those two plants are both a 16 by 35 ear. My other two planting dates, so there's 4 planting dates here. So this is April 13th, and this one's kind of interesting. I'll point this out. This is the only 18 around that I had. So that's an 18 by 36. So actually this ear, this April 13th ear, would have the most kernels on it because it's got 2 more rows and it's basically the same length. Now, the interesting thing on this ear is things got really, really rough right at the end of the pollination window on this planting date. So look how perfect those rows are. Now there's one missing here or there. So like here's right there. We're missing a kernel there. So there's one kernel missing from that row. You can see already how the other kernels around that hole are going to fill in for it. And the kernels here around the one that's missing will all be bigger. There may not be any yield reduction whatsoever because that kernel is missing there. But you missed a kernel there. Now up here towards the end, everything looks pretty good till about here. And then from here on up, it's just like a shotgun. You don't really have rows. You've just got random kernels there. Things got kind of wonky in that pollination window. And so, and this was an April 13th planting date with a 118-day hybrid. So a April 13th planting date with a 105-day hybrid might not show this because it would have been pollinating under different conditions. And that's one of the reasons that, we recommend spreading things out a little bit. Now this year's got a little bit of everything. There is some tip back up here, and then we had about a day or two there worth pollination that things were kind of sketchy. And interestingly enough, the next planting date, which is April 27th, if you can read that, this is probably the ear that has the poorest pollination scattered throughout the ear. So you can see just looking at this ear, a lot of those rows aren't perfect. You got stuff kind of randomly missing, especially right in through kind of in the middle part of the ear. So this ear is pretty good up to about here. And then from here on up, things got a little helter-skelter. Not enough to impact yield, but enough to impact pollination. Perfect pollination doesn't always get you more yield. Matter of fact, it rarely gets you more yield. The difference in yield between, say, 90% pollination and 100% pollination is probably nil. Now, if your pollination is bad enough, it's going to impact your yield. And if you're producing seed, you're not worried about yield. You're worried about number of kernels. So in a seed field, pollination is a big deal because every kernel you miss is a seed that you're not producing. But these two plants, this one was younger by 2 weeks. And so what was going on at this time on this ear was going on at this time on this ear. So both of these ears are reflective of, I think, the same stressful pollination period. Can't tell you what days that was. I might be able to figure it out if I studied the weather data enough. But you can see it impacting both of those ears. Now, by the time my favorite, my May 13th ear came along, this is top to bottom. This is the best pollinated ear here. It's got the most tip back. But by the time this ear came along, now there is a spot right there, right here, that you can see is not perfect. Got a little wonky there, but as you spin that around, that's a beautifully pollinated ear of corn. It was even perfectly pollinated out here on the tip until they aborted. So pollination was really good. But stressful after pollination resulted in a lot of tip back. I wouldn't even call that a lot of tip back. That's a moderate amount of tip back. I mean, I've seen ears like a third of the ear tips back, and that's I would agree. That's a little frustrating when you see that much tip back. But as you look at ears now, there's lots of things you can look at. How many rows, how long, how much tip back. We're starting to get an indication of what kind of kernel depth we're going to get, what kind of kernel size we're going to get, what kind of factor we should be using for our meaningless yield calculations that people like to do. I say meaningless because if you're really good and you spend a lot of time in corn, you'll probably be plus or minus 20 bushel of what your corn actually ends up yielding. And I guess you need some idea about how much grain you need to market. So there's a purpose in doing that. But I prefer to do my yield checks with the combine because that's really the only accurate yield check you're going to do. And I've got some illustrations here of, so for example, I'll just hold this up so you can look at it. So down here, I've got 4 different ears. So I'll get that position right so you can see it. So I got a 20 by 30 hypothetical, 18 by 34, 16 by 38, 14 by 40. So what do you notice there? As ears get girthier, they get shorter. It's just going to happen. And of those 4 hypothetical ear sizes, there's the number of kernels on them: 600, 612, 608, 560. So if you assume 34,000 ears and you assume 80,000 kernels per bushel, there are your yields on those 4 yield checks: 255, 260, 258, 238. If you're really optimistic and you think, it's only going to take 70,000 kernels to make a bushel because we got really good moisture and my crop's really healthy and this stuff's going to finish strong, and I'm going to make 56 pounds of corn with 70,000 kernels. So just going from 80 to 70, you can see the yield jump there. And those years when you do yield checks and your actual yield is 30 bushel better than your yield check, and you're wondering, how in the hell did that happen? Well, that's how. You've got really big kernels. But what typically happens is, and the column there in the middle with the parentheses beside it, this is my bar napkin math to illustrate this point. I think all 4 of these ears will likely yield the same. And here's why. I think an 80,000 kernel factor is probably reasonable. I hope we do a little better than that. And if you've got ears that don't have a lot of kernels, you may be bigger than 70. Because the more kernels you've got on an ear, the smaller they're going to be. I don't care how good a farmer you are. I don't care how much money you spend on fertilizer, fungicide, micros. I don't care how many times you wide drop a field. You cannot trick Mother Nature. The more kernels you've got on an ear, the smaller they're going to be. It's just math and physics, and you can't beat math and physics. Now, no matter how many kernels you've got, you want to make them as big as you can. So everything you're doing to make bigger kernels, that's good. You need to keep doing that. But here's what happens in the real world. So there's your 4 ears. And if you use a 80 factor, the first ear with 600 kernels, going to yield 255. If you use an 81.5 factor, the second ear with 612 kernels is going to yield 255. If you use an 81 factor, the third ear with 608 kernels is going to yield 255. And if you're bold enough to use a 74.5 factor on the ear with 560 kernels, it's going to make 255. That is why kernel counts do not really correlate to yield, because as the kernel count changes, you need to adjust the factor. And the factor that we use is always a wild, guess. Maybe you would say your guess is an educated guess based on lots of experience. It's still a guess. And that is probably the biggest error. Maybe an even bigger error is overestimating what's the size of the average ear. Another big mistake we make is I planted 36,000 seeds, so I used 36,000 as my ear count without actually counting my ears. And if you drop 36,000 seeds, you don't have 36,000 ears. You might have 34, you might have 34.5. If you're really lucky, you might have 35, you might have 29. You don't know until you count the ears. Plants are irrelevant. We need to know how many ears we've got. And then once we know how many ears we've got and how many kernels we have on the average ear, assuming we count the average ear and our eyes don't gravitate towards the big ones, then we've still got the factor that can range from. So we just had Kevin Kalb here at our seed kickoff meeting last week, and was really honored to have Kevin and Sean here with us. Fascinating conversation about raising, what he does to raise 425 bushel corn. I asked Kevin, I said, because all these yield guys, they all do this when they know how many ears they've got, they know how many kernels they've got, and they know what yield they accomplish at the end. So then you can back calculate what was my actual factor? How many kernels did it take for me to make 56 pounds of 15% corn? And I asked him, I said, what's the smallest factor, biggest kernel you've ever grown, to produce one of your yield contest winning yields? And he said 53. So he has documented that one time he only needed 53,000 kernels to make 56 pounds of grain. And that's crazy. But I know a lot of normal farmers that do the same thing that, have gotten down into the upper 60s with a factor. And just do the math sometime. Compare 70 to 90. I mean, it changes at like 60 bushels. So, and if you want to grow big kernels, here's what you need. You need a plant that's healthy. Needs to be healthy, not just on the leaves, needs to be healthy in the roots. You need to have good moisture. And if you really want to get greedy, you need cool nights. The more days it takes to go from pollination to black layer, the more days that plant is harvesting sunlight, the slower it is maturing, the slower it accumulates heat units, the bigger the kernels are going to be. You've got more sunlight being harvested. So if your grain fill takes 70 days, you're going to harvest a lot more sunlight than if your grain fill takes 50 days. And that's one thing that's going to work against our yield a little bit this year. We got through grain fill pretty fast because we had very warm temperatures. Now we're healthy. We've got good moisture. August so far has been, August is trending where it's going to be wet. We've been on this wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry cycle all year long. March was dry. April was wet, near record wet. May was dry. June was wet, near record wet. July was below average, not necessarily dry, but it was below average. And now the way April is acting, we may be above average rainfall for August. We may be above average rainfall for the month of August, which is great for our beans and good for our corn making the most out of what's there. Now, some of it was so messed up by overly saturated soils in June. You can't fix that. Now, you could make it worse with hot, dry weather. So we're going to make the most of it. There's some acres out there that making the most of it means it's going to make 50 rather than 0. But you got the good parts of the field that hopefully are going to maybe be making 280 instead of 240. That's not going to make up for the 0 or the 50 in that field, but it'll help. And so, we want to stay cool. We want to stay moist from here on out, and then get hot and dry so we don't have that scary wet fall that some of the weather forecasters are talking about. As a devout no-tiller, I live in fear of wet falls. I don't intend to do anything in the mud at harvest on my farm. So if all Mother Nature gives me is mud, that's very sad for me. So hopefully, I know last year was a bit crazy. Enough rain that you're not worried about a fire every day would be nice, and enough rain that you get a day or two here or there where you can fix stuff without losing downtime in the field, or maybe if you're like me, if you like to be lazy every now and then, but you feel better about being lazy if you're doing it on a day when you couldn't be harvesting anyway. That's a good thing. So, where we go from here on yield is going to be all based on, the health of the plant, how warm it is at night, what kind of sunlight we get, and what kind of moisture we have. Whoa, the boss is asking me a question. Kernel factor is a primary source of potential air, and sample size is usually insufficient to capture field variability of yield components. Doesn't he sound smart? He is smart. That's why he sounds that way. So thanks, Sean, for clarifying. He said it more. He said it more brainy than I do. And Sean's a very modest guy, so he doesn't act like he's smart, but he's brilliant. He's just humbly brilliant. So thanks for that clarification, Sean. And best boss in the world, by the way. So those of you who have a good boss, you know what I'm talking about. That you can have a job you love, but if you're doing a job you love for a boss you hate, it's hard to enjoy your job. I never have had a boss I hated, by the way. For those of you, if I've got any former bosses watching, Sean might be the best, but I've had lots and lots of good bosses. I've been blessed. They might not say the same thing about me as an employee, but I have enjoyed. I even had a boss that decided I didn't need to keep my job one time, and I still like that boss too. So moving on. So let's talk a little bit more about diseases. So I mentioned Physoderma earlier. I pulled off a couple horrifically bad leaves off of Physoderma plants. So I do want to call out that when it is awful, like that whole midrib there is just covered with black. They don't look like black spots. It just looks like black. Down here on the leaf sheath, you can see all the black dots. But all this chlorosis on this leaf, all the yellowing, all the turning brown, all looks like the leaf is dying. That's Physoderma as well. And when you've got that level of infection, this plant basically doesn't have an ear. It's got a little nubbin on it. This plant's not going to amount to much of anything. Now, I've talked to Rachel. I've talked to other pathologists. Pathologists do not believe that it's the Physoderma that made this plant a runt. They believe that this was a runt plant, and the runt plant just happened to get a more severe infection of Physoderma. So they don't actually believe, I'm not convinced of this, but they don't believe that this plant is stunted because of this disease. They believe it's a stunted plant with disease. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But you can find these out there, these horrible looking plants. Now, what we worry more about with Physoderma is something that it can cause that we call Physoderma node breakage, which when you get a severe Physoderma infection and it infects at the node on the lower stalk, get through all my bad aphid pictures here to get to my bad Physoderma picture. So I was scouting in a field, and I was walking across the end rows to get out into the field. You should go far enough in a field to get out of the end rows when you're scouting. And I'm not a skinny guy. I got to spread the plants apart so I can step through the row. And I did that, and this plant went pop. And I thought, uh-oh, better look a little closer. So if you find a plant that is snapped off clean at the node, and I've got another picture of the stump. So there's what the stump of that plant looks like. And you can see it's black all the way around. So that node has been infected with the Physoderma, the fungal pathogen that causes Physoderma. And that node, that lesion around the node has girdled that plant. Now the plant's still translocating. That plant looked beautiful. Leaves were nice. The leaves didn't look like this. Now they had Physoderma on them. Well, here was, I got another picture of that here somewhere. Find it easily. There. That plant might have looked like that, but it had a good ear and it was growing fine, but that node is brittle and weak. And, if you don't have a fat agronomist walking through your field, it may never break off. But if a deer hits it, or we get a windstorm, at the right time, you can snap those plants off. And so if you start to notice plants that are not broken over, like with a weak or rotten stalk from crown rot, but snapped off, particularly if they snapped off right at the node, and particularly if that node has that dark girdling lesion around it, that is Physoderma. And East Central Illinois fights it probably more than anywhere else in Illinois. My colleague Randy Niver, he's kind of my go-to guy for all things Physoderma because he fights it more than I do. What causes it? And if you think back to the year we've had, this is going to make sense to you. What causes it is water in the whorl during the whorl stage of corn. And when is the whorl stage of corn? If you plant at a normal time in Central Illinois, well, there's a lot of whorl stage corn going on in the month of June. How many days in the month of June did we have water in the whorl of our whorl stage corn? I don't know, 15, 20. We had a lot of days where we had excellent potential to infect plants with Physoderma. You can probably control it with a fungicide application, but we don't ever apply fungicides at the right time to control it. And the timing is totally dependent on when is there water in the whorl. So we do not consider fungicide applications to be effective for preventing Physoderma. If you wanted to spray fungicide every week from like V4 to tassel, you could probably prevent it. Maybe you could probably spray every 2 weeks and prevent it, but nobody's going to do that. So we typically just live with a little bit of Physoderma. When the node breakage occurs, that's when it gets hard to live with. If all you're seeing is the black spots on the leaf sheaths and on the leaves, got more Sean Evans here. He's pointing out he's been seeing. I like it when Sean's helping me with Ask the Agronomist. This is good. I've been seeing a lot of stalk lesions on the sheath that resemble Physoderma up and down the stalk and husk. However, the leaf and nodal lesions are lacking. Could this be anthracnose? Okay, so I don't think so. Let me use this picture here. That is absolutely not anthracnose, because if you look closely at that, you can see the polka dots, you can see the barber pole. If you've got one black splotch on your leaf sheath, I don't necessarily think that's anthracnose either. I think that's typically saprophytic fungi that are decomposing the dust and dirt and pollen and anthers and all the crap that gets tucked down in behind the leaf sheath. So typically, if you peel the leaf sheath off and those discolored splotches are just on the leaf sheath, I just think that's discoloration from saprophytic fungi living behind that leaf sheath. Now, if you start to see that discoloration on the stalk itself, then that could be an anthracnose. I haven't seen anything I would call anthracnose yet, but that doesn't mean that there's not some out there. But I think anthracnose, is going to be more visible on the stalk than it is on the sheath. And I think a lot of the black spots that on the leaf sheath that people call anthracnose, I actually don't think that's really a plant disease as much as it is saprophytic fungi working, in that. I mean, if you think about the moisture and the environment that exists between the leaf sheath and the stalk, that's a good place to be a fungus that's decomposing something. So, Sean said he wish he had a picture. I've got one somewhere, but I'm not going to take 20 minutes scrolling through it on my phone because it would be an old picture. But yeah, there are lots of things, and Sean's point's a good one. There are lots of things that can cause black spots on the leaf sheath, on the leaf, on the stalk, and they might be different causes based on where they are. Most of this stuff we're seeing is all on the leaf sheath, which there's your, okay, here's a spot. Now that's not a good example of what Sean's talking about, but there's a discolored, kind of a dark, kind of a blackened area, kind of purplish looking right there on that leaf sheath. I mean, is it possible that that's anthracnose? Yes, but I think it's more likely that it's, and here you can see them really easily if you open it up. That is not a plant disease. that is just fungal pathogens that are decomposing dead stuff that's wrapped around the stalk, trapped behind the leaf sheath, and you can kind of start to see it through the leaf sheath. Now that is a little square wheel I made with a marker. Ignore that. But all this other stuff is kind of what Sean's talking about. And I think that's primarily saprophytic fungi. Saprophyte's just a fancy term for a fungus that eats dead tissue, and there's lots of dead stuff trapped in behind that leaf sheath. Okay, so we've talked about. Let's talk a little bit more about crown rot. So what crown rot's going to look like first? Typically, is a plant that's firing and it's dying from the bottom up. And it just looks stressed. Now that plant's not dead yet. It hasn't ghosted. It's just feeling the effects of having a sick root system that's not doing a good job getting what the plant needs. And so it's short on water, it's short on nutrients, it's short on lots of stuff. And so it's cannibalizing the lower canopy to keep the more important parts of the plant alive. And as it gets worse and worse and worse, that just moves up the plant. Eventually, that turns into a ghosted plant that the whole plant just dies. And they go from green to silver to brown in about 3 or 4 days in the field, just like that. And those plants, when you dig them up, you're going to see a lot of discoloration in the crown of those plants. You're going to have a pithy stalk that has just kind of disintegrated inside. You can pinch those stalks really easy. So that's one of the measurements that we do on our crown rot trials is we'll do either a pinch test, a push test, or a kick test on the lower stalk. And if it's got crown rot in it, that stalk, long before the plant dies, it has completely cannibalized itself, because before it dies, before it gives up, it's going to remobilize nutrients from anywhere it can. It's going to pull them out of the leaf. It's going to pull it out of the stalk. It's going to pull it out of wherever to try to keep that plant alive and growing, because it's trying to produce the yield that it wants to produce. So by the time the plant is a ghosted plant, the stalk quality is gone. And so we lose yield from crown rot in 2 ways. It contributes to physical loss by lodging and ear droppage and plants, disintegrating in the field to where the ear doesn't get harvested. And then it actually takes real yield by killing the plant prematurely. So you're going to end up with a very shallow, very light kernel that might take 110 or 120,000 kernels to make 56 pounds of grain, not 70 or 75 or 85,000 kernels. And you're gonna see crown rot worse, depending on the hybrid, based on planting date, soil type, and weather. Planting dates that favor it are earlier planting dates. Soil types that favor it are heavy, black, high organic matter, the good stuff kind of soils. You don't see it as much on timber soil. That's one way that we timber soil guys can kind of level the playing field out a little bit with our prairie soil farming neighbors, is that you're going to have less crown rot killing your crop prematurely on those lighter soils. And then the really important thing, and this is what's been kind of missing from this year so far, is stress during grain fill. And stress during grain fill can come from numerous ways. It could be heat, could be drought, could be disease. Last year we had all the above. We were dry, it was plenty warm, we had a lot of southern rust, a lot of tar spot. So plants were really, really, really stressed late grain fill. And if you've got crown rot in your roots, if you don't, that plant's going to be able to handle those stresses, and it's not going to ghost, and it's not going to die prematurely. It'll fire, it'll show stress, but it doesn't die. It reaches a normal black layer. But last year we didn't probably have as much crown rot infections in the roots because we had a really dry spring. We had a very ideal planting window. We didn't work ground wet. We didn't plant ground wet. We didn't didn't go through really wet periods because we had a dry spring last year. And then even though we had, perfect conditions for crown rot to really get bad late in the season, it wasn't the worst I've ever seen. This year's kind of the opposite. We've probably got more crown rot infections in our root systems this year than we did last year, but we haven't had the stress that we need to have to really make it bad. So, I don't know how bad crown rot's going to get. I've seen a few fields that are showing symptoms. I've got symptoms in my plots where I'm trying to make it happen. If you looked around and thought, hey, I think I can get by without spraying fungicide this year, that increases crown rot as well, because the plant's under more stress because they didn't get that fungal protection. So not spraying fungicide can increase the incidence of crown rot as well. So I don't know if it's going to end up being a bad crown rot year or not. My gut would tell me probably not, because we haven't had that really severe stress during grain fill. But if you were unlucky, so for example, Monmouth had 2 inches of rain yesterday. I had 3/10 on a lot of my ground yesterday, and I was supposed to get an inch today. Yesterday it said that. Today it says I'm going to get 1/10 today. So not everybody is super moist right now. So if you get dry, here over the next 2 to 3 weeks, that will probably be what exposes, how much crown rot you've got. And I was in a field a couple of weeks ago with a grower that had been through a really stressful stretch in July, and he was starting to see some crown rot in the field. And you could dig up a unhealthy looking plant, knock the soil off the roots, and just look at how brown the roots were. And if you split that plant down through the crown, that crown was very brown. If you went to another part of the field where the plants were still green, not fired at all, looked like $1,000,000, you dug those up, nice white, healthy, more hair roots. The roots that were there were a much healthier looking color. You split the crown open, was not brown. I mean, if you just looked at the roots and looked at the crown without looking at the rest of the plant, you could tell which plant had a better ear and which plant had green leaves versus which plant was already half brown because it was fired up to the ear. So if you're seeing firing in fields and you dig roots and you can see some brownish discolored roots, if the roots look, just not super healthy, that's crown rot. And when you split that crown open, you're going to be able to see that brown discoloration. And the more stress we have, the more advanced and the more pronounced that's going to get. The plants I was looking at 2 weeks ago, the stalk was still solid. The stalk didn't look too bad. It probably does now. It's probably, been cannibalized more by now. Now, the additional moisture that we've got, that's going to kind of alleviate some stress. Won't make the disease go away, but it will slow the progression of the disease. And that's what's going to help that plant maintain a little more stalk quality if we don't get a lot of stress. So let's talk about soybeans a little bit here. The soybean situation, a lot of beans just looked hideous in June. No other way to say it. I mean, there were bean fields that were as yellow as that grain in June for weeks in June, and you thought they were going to die. So some of them were dying. We had Phytophthora that was taking out plants. They were stunted. They were yellow. They just awful. And when July came and we warmed up and dried out, and we got in some cases too dry, that's what those beans needed. Now they still don't have as good a root system. They've still been through a rough time. Those areas may be just as green as the rest of the field today, but they don't have the pod count that the rest of the field has. They don't have the yield potential that the rest of the field does, but they've got reasonable potential. And what the soybeans need is the same thing the corn needs. They need good moisture in August. They need it to be not too hot. They need to be healthy. And if your plants are healthy, the top of the plant is going to be able to compensate a little bit for what's missing down lower in the plant. I've talked to people that think they might have the best bean crop they've ever had. I've talked to people that are pretty pessimistic on their beans. This crop is extremely variable. I have joked with people that they need to cancel the crop tour this year, because when you randomly walk into a random field, you could walk into 80 bushel corn or 300 bushel corn. You could walk into 40 bushel beans or 100 bushel beans. And I just don't really know how you're going to gauge, what's out there until we actually get it out of the field. So I think it's going to be really hard to pin a number on this crop that's very accurate, because of the variability that exists out there. Not just variability across the state, but variability in every field based on drainage, based on how much rain you had in June, based on how much rain you got in July, based on, was your June rain an inch followed by an inch followed by an inch followed by an inch, or was it 6 inches followed by 4 inches followed by 2 inches? That's totally different. Did it set there for days, or did it all run out of the field, the day that it happened? So, there's just a lot of variability out there, and I think it's going to be really tough. But, I think we're certainly have the potential to finish strong. We haven't been able to do that the last few years. We've been finishing the growing season in a drought, with a lot of heat, with a lot of disease. This year, we're finishing the growing season with good moisture, based on forecast, with some moderate temperatures, and based on what we're seeing today, pretty good plant health. Now, red crown rot is out there in the regions that have been battling red crown rot. They're still battling it. That disease is continuing to spread, continuing to show up in new areas every year. I haven't seen much in my travels. Well, I'll be honest, I haven't seen any in my travels, except when I went to St. Louis. When I drove down Highway 67 or 267, down through Evans Land, I saw a red crown rot. Around here, I have not. Doesn't mean it's not there, but it's certainly not as prevalent. And that disease is devastating when you have it. And it's like kind of like sudden death on steroids. And we're doing a lot of work with germplasm screening and looking at different seed treatment protocols and things to try to reduce the damage from red crown rot until we find a more complete solution. But the guys that have it bad in areas, the most complete solution you can have on the farm is you don't plant beans in that field for many, many years, and you take your chances on corn, which can also sometimes be problematic, but it's probably not as problematic as fighting red crown rot in your soybeans. So anyway, I think we're coming up on time here. If anybody's got another quick question, put it in the chat. Thanks, Sean, for adding to the conversation here this morning. I think, aphids. My goodness, Marie. If Marie's watching, she probably couldn't believe that Lance was going to do a whole episode of Ask the Agronomist and not even talk about aphids. And you're right, Marie. I'm not going to do that. So we got an extra bonus section here of Ask the Agronomist where we'll touch on aphids. So been getting a lot of calls about aphids the past 2 or 3 weeks. There is another crop of aphids that has shown up on the scene. They tend to be lower in the canopy this time of year. So generally the ear or below. I have been in a couple fields that have a really heavy population all the way up to and even crawling all over the ear, which looks pretty scary. Now, if your corn is, this far along, which I'm going to sacrifice this beautiful ear here. Yeah. So we got a milk line moving on this, so this is 118-day corn. Milk line's just starting there. You can just see the milk line. That's where the kernel goes from, kind of nice orange, dark yellow to the pale. That'd be the milk line. So probably a couple weeks, maybe a little more from black layer on this. So this is 118-day corn that's going to black layer probably in August. And, when I talked about having that long, slow grain fill period, if you've got corn that's black layering in August, that means it got mature pretty fast. Now, this corn was also planted extremely early, but I had a grower comment to me the other day. He says, I've just never had really good corn when it black layers in August. And I said, well, that's kind of because, usually when it's black layering in August, it's doing that because it's not particularly healthy. If it's black layering in August because you planted it in March and because we've accumulated 4,000 heat units during your growing season, then that may not necessarily be bad. But the old rule of thumb typically is true, is we tend to have our highest yielding years when we mature late, and years where we mature early. And again, because it's usually because it's maturing early because of stress or a problem. If it's just maturing early because it got planted early and we've accumulated a lot of heat units, I'm not sure that means what people usually think it means. Could still be pretty good. Those are pretty good sized kernels on that ear. Not, probably not Kevin Kalb sized kernels, but those are good kernels. That cob's pretty small. Those kernels will weigh good. So, I think this is that to me looks like an ear that, 80,000 or less would be the right factor for that ear. So, that's going to give us some pretty good numbers. But anyway, soybeans, same thing. It's seed size. From here on out, you've got how many pods you're going to get. You could still have some small pods at the top that came on late. There was a good flush there of pods at the top of the plant, which I like to see that. Like to see those clusters, just makes it look awesome. The rest of the plant is more important than what's going on right there at the top, but you can add a few bushels with those clusters at the top. So bring it on. That's okay. But back to our aphids. So if you are thinking that you maybe need to do something about aphids, if your corn's this far along, you don't need to do anything about aphids. There is not time for them to do damage in that field enough they may be doing damage, but if it's done, it's done, and you can't fix that. Now, this mid-May planted corn, it's a lot further from black layer. They could do more damage, and they tend to be more problematic in the later planted corn. That's one of the, I love my May planted corn, but so do aphids. So, the less mature your corn is, the more time they have to do damage. But the level of aphid pressure that you need to have to cause a economic level of injury, which needs to be several bushels, because it's not cheap to try to control them. So if you're losing less than probably 7 or 8 bushels, you're better off to ignore it. Now, nobody can tell you how many bushels you're losing, but there's several factors to consider. How thick are the aphids, and they got to be bad. I mean, I want every plant with a lot of aphids before I even think about spraying them this late. Do you think you can actually get coverage on the aphids, which is a big concern? The systemic products that can move in the plant will probably do a better job, but even those products are not going to translocate from the top of the plant down to the bottom of the canopy. So they're more locally systemic in the plant. You've got beneficials out there that we would like to protect that are getting those aphids. The plant's not under a tremendous amount of stress because we've got good moisture in general. So there's a lot of factors out there that make me think the right thing to do is just ignore them this time of year. We've learned the hard way the last 2 or 3 years. You cannot ignore them at tassel. If you ignore them at tassel, here's what you get. You get that. That is an individual plant that was completely loaded with aphids. That is an ear that was 100% pollinated and then just aborted the whole ear. So that's what happens when you ignore them at tassel. And if that happens on 1 or 2% of your plants, probably wasn't worth doing anything about it. If this happens on 20 or 30% of your plants, which we saw that in 2024. I have not seen that this year. We had aphids bad enough this year that we probably needed to do something about it, but they weren't as bad as they were in 24. So I'm seeing this on a much, much, much less lower frequency than I did in 2024. But they can't do that to you now. The only way they can reduce yield is by making your kernels smaller. So the yield loss might still be real, could in some cases still be, enough bushels to justify trying to do something. The other fear I have is let's say you're committed to, I don't care. I want to be on the safe side. I don't like what I see. I don't like seeing my plant leaves covered with honeydew, because that means they're drawing that out of the plant. That's like the blood of your corn plant all over its leaves when they're covered with honeydew. I don't like that. I'm going to do everything I can do to raise the best crop I can raise. I'm going to kill me some aphids, and I'm going to use a good product. I'm going to spend $15+ an acre on the product plus the application, and I'm going to kill me some aphids. And then we don't get good enough penetration down into the lower canopy. We don't even get the product to where the aphids are, and you spend the money and you kill none of them. That would be the worst case scenario. Doing nothing would be better than that. And I can't promise you if you try to kill them that you can get them controlled. So I think it's risky to to make a treatment late like this. You might feel it's more risky not to. That's your call. But there's a lot of aphids out there, and they're not just in the hybrids that they tend to like. We're seeing them just. It's more of a field by field situation. I have been in some situations where I've been a little bit nervous that maybe we have more aphids there today because we used an insecticide earlier in the season when we maybe didn't have to, or we used an insecticide that's not an effective aphid insecticide. So if we're going to continue to see aphids on a semi-regular basis, we need to really think about what we're doing when we're applying insecticides in corn, because the insecticides that we most typically apply in corn will kill everything but aphids. And that's a really good way to grow aphids. So we are not particularly good at managing aphids in the Midwest. Now, our colleagues in Texas, they know how to manage aphids. They do it every year. And we're trying to learn from them. The problem for our growers is the products that they use in Texas, we don't like to use because they're expensive. But using cheap stuff to try to control aphids is extremely costly as well, because that's not an effective way to manage aphids. So we'll talk more about aphid management in the future. We learn more every year. They continue to surprise us, just as tar spot is surprising us this year. Tar spot is surprising us in a good way because it's not here. For the most part, shouldn't say it's not here because it is here, but it's here at low levels that are not going to impact yield the way that it looks today. And aphids are surprising us because they're here, and they're here in large numbers, and they're here early in the growing season, and they're doing things that we used to say was really rare and wouldn't happen often. Some of you have had aphids in your corn 3 years in a row, and you're starting to get tired of hearing somebody say that, well, aphids aren't really usually a problem. So we're learning more about aphids as the years go by. So with that, I will wrap up there for today. Thank you for hanging with me. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the live participation. I love it. We will be back in 2 weeks, which I didn't look up that date, but that'll be like the 27th probably of August-ish, if I'm doing the math correct. So whatever that Thursday is, we'll be back with our next episode. Hopefully Heather will be back. Hopefully we'll be back on the iPad with a little better quality for you. And Everybody stay safe. Hopefully you keep getting some moisture and keep adding weight to those soybean seeds and those corn kernels.